Dakota Territory, 1879. The town of Clearwater sat like a collection of weathered dominoes on the vast prairie, where winter storms could raise a homestead to splinters and summer sun baked the land until it cracked like old leather. It was here that Pearl Evans stepped from the westbound stagecoach, her slate blue travel dress wrinkled from the 3-day journey, her honey blonde hair escaping its pins after the rough ride across the territory. At 23, Pearl had grown accustomed to the sideways glances and whispered judgments that followed her like shadows. She squared her shoulders beneath her woolen shawl and lifted her chin, refusing to show the weariness that had settled in her bones after being turned away from 4 towns in as many months. No room for your kind, they always said, though what kind that was depended on who was doing the rejecting. Some called her a troublemaker for speaking against injustice. Others whispered, fallen woman, because she traveled alone. In Deadwood, the mining baron had simply said she asked too many questions about workers' conditions. In each place, the result was the same. A door slammed in her face, another journey westward. Pearl believed the frontier had no place for a woman who refused to bow her head and stay silent. The West demanded conformity disguised as rugged individualism, and she'd learned that survival meant moving on before the whispers turned to threats. She'd convinced herself that belonging was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when speaking the truth was as natural to her as breathing. She approached Clearwater's lone hotel with dwindling hope and even fewer funds. The stagecoach ticket had taken most of what remained from her teaching salary back in Ohio. Pearl needed work, a roof, and to disappear into the background for once. Impossible, as that seemed with her outspoken nature. Rooms $2 a night, the hotel keeper said, eyeing her single valise suspiciously. What brings you to Clearwater, miss? We don't get many unmarried ladies traveling alone. I'm seeking employment, Pearl answered, counting out her remaining coins. I was a schoolteacher back east. The hotel keeper's expression soured. Our last teacher left after that suffrage pamphlet business. Town doesn't need more radical notions poisoning our children's minds. Pearl's stomach tightened. Her reputation had somehow arrived before her. I assure you, sir, I'm simply looking for honest work. Perhaps Millerton might suit you better, he replied coldly. Stagecoach leaves tomorrow. One night. She had one night before being forced to move on again. The following morning, Pearl walked Clearwater's dusty Main Street, inquiring at every establishment. The general store didn't need help. The dressmaker hurried her out when she mentioned her previous employment. By midday, her hope had withered like prairie grass in August. The stagecoach wasn't due until 4 o'clock. With nowhere else to go, Pearl found herself at the edge of town where a weathered sign announced Clearwater Livery and Blacksmith. The smell of hay and horses drifted from the open doors. With nothing to lose, she stepped inside. The livery's cool interior was a blessed relief from the punishing sun. Pearl's eyes adjusted slowly to the dimness, revealing a young man bent over a horse's hoof, working with focused precision. He couldn't have been more than 25, with broad shoulders tapering to a narrow waist, his shirt sleeves rolled to expose forearms corded with lean muscle. His light brown hair curled slightly at the collar of his shirt, and when he looked up, Pearl was struck by eyes the color of summer grass. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, gently setting down the horse's hoof and straightening to his full height. "I was wondering if you might need assistance," Pearl said, the words tumbling out before she could reconsider. "I'm capable with accounts and correspondence, and I learn quickly." The young man wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. His face was open, with a strong jawline softened by a day's worth of light stubble. He studied her with an expression Pearl couldn't quite read. "I'm Blake McAllister," he said finally. "This is my place." "Pearl Evans," she replied, extending her hand as she would to a business associate rather than dropping a curtsy as propriety might demand. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Mr. McAllister." To her surprise, he took her hand without hesitation, his grip firm but careful, as though he was accustomed to measuring his strength. "You're new to Clearwater." "And likely leaving today," Pearl admitted. "The stagecoach departs at 4. Blake's brow furrowed. "So soon? You've hardly had time to see the place. I've seen enough to know there's no welcome for me here." The bitterness in her voice surprised even Pearl. "It seems my reputation precedes me." "Reputation?" Blake leaned against a support beam, crossing his ankles. His ease made Pearl acutely aware of her own rigid posture. I speak my mind, Mr. McAllister. Some find that unsuitable in a woman. Pearl expected him to nod in understanding and politely dismiss her, as countless others had done. Instead, Blake smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made Pearl's breath catch. Truth be told, Miss Evans, I could use someone who speaks their mind. My accounts are in terrible disarray, and I've more horses than time these days. Pearl blinked, certain she'd misheard. You're offering me employment? Unless you've got your heart set on that stagecoach ride, Blake replied. Pays fair, room at the boarding house included. Mrs. Patterson runs a respectable place for working women. But you don't know me, Pearl protested. The hotel keeper practically ordered me to leave town. Blake shrugged one shoulder. Old Simmons hasn't forgiven the world for moving forward since 65. I judge folks on their merits, not their gossip value. It was the most unlikely reprieve. Pearl wanted to accept immediately, but caution held her back. The town won't like it. They'll talk. Let them, Blake said simply. I need help, you need work. The rest is just noise. That afternoon, instead of boarding the stagecoach, Pearl moved into Mrs. Patterson's boarding house with the handful of possessions that had followed her across 4 states. The older woman's rules were strict but fair, and for the first time in months, Pearl slept without wondering where she'd be forced to go next. Working at the livery brought unexpected peace. Blake taught her the business methodically, how to track boarding fees, order supplies, and manage the correspondence from ranchers across the territory. He never questioned her abilities, simply showed her what needed doing and trusted her to learn. Pearl organized the chaotic office within a week, creating orderly ledgers and filing systems that had Blake whistling in appreciation. You've saved me hours of confusion, he told her. I'm starting to think you're overqualified. I find satisfaction in creating order, Pearl admitted, arranging the newly labeled shelves. And it's pleasant to work somewhere I'm tolerated. Blake frowned, pausing while hanging a bridle. Is that how you see it? Being tolerated. Pearl smoothed her practical brown skirt, chosen for livery work rather than fashion. It's more than I've had elsewhere. That's a mighty low bar, Miss Evans, Blake said softly. Folks should be valued, not tolerated. His words stayed with Pearl long after the workday ended. Valued, not tolerated. The concept was foreign after months of rejection. As May turned to June, Pearl settled into a routine. Mornings at the livery, afternoons helping Blake with the horses when business was slow. He taught her to brush down the gentler mares, explaining each animal's temperament with a patience that revealed his deep affection for the creatures in his care. This one's Sophie, he said one afternoon, stroking a dappled gray mare. Sweetest disposition you'll find, but she spooked at a rattler last year and threw her rider. Now everyone thinks she's dangerous. Pearl approached cautiously, extending her hand as Blake had taught her. The mare nuzzled her palm gently. She doesn't seem dangerous to me. Most folks don't look past first impressions, Blake replied, watching Pearl with the horse. They see one bad moment and think they know all there is to know. Their eyes met over the mare's back, and Pearl felt a curious warmth spread through her chest. You see deeper than most, Mr. McAllister. Blake, he corrected gently. After 6 weeks of mucking stalls together, I reckon we're past formalities. The town remained cool toward Pearl, but no longer openly hostile. Mrs. Patterson had vouched for her boarder's character, and Blake's quiet support carried surprising weight in Clearwater. Still, Pearl kept to herself, unwilling to risk the fragile acceptance she'd gained. One scorching July afternoon, Pearl was reviewing supply invoices when she heard raised voices from the livery floor. Blake rarely raised his voice, which made the angry tone all the more startling. I won't sell her, Harrison, Blake was saying firmly. Not to you or anyone else. Be reasonable, McAllister, a deeper voice responded. That animal's worth good money, and everyone knows you could use it with the railroad buying up land west of here. Pearl moved to the office doorway. Blake stood with his back to her, facing a heavy-set man with an expensive hat and a gun belt that looked more decorative than functional. 3 other men flanked him, all wearing similar expressions of entitled impatience. Sophie's not for sale, Blake repeated. She's still recovering. Harrison sighed dramatically. It's just a horse, son, and I've offered twice market value. She's not just a horse, Blake insisted, his shoulders tense. And she's not for sale at any price. The confrontation was escalating. Pearl could see it in the way Harrison's men shifted their stances, hands drifting toward their gun belts. Without thinking, she stepped forward. "Gentlemen," she said clearly, "I believe Mr. McAllister has business correspondence that requires your attention, Mr. Harrison." All 5 men turned to stare at her. Pearl maintained her composure, crossing to the desk where she retrieved a fictional letter she'd mentioned solely to defuse the tension. From the Railroad Commission, she improvised, extending the paper toward Harrison. "Regarding your property inquiry." Harrison hesitated, then took the paper. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the blank page. "There's nothing here." "Precisely," Pearl replied coolly. "Much like your claim that the railroad is buying land west of town. According to their latest survey maps, which arrived yesterday, they've chosen the northern route." It was a complete fabrication, but delivered with such conviction that Harrison's face paled. He crumpled the paper. "This isn't over, McAllister. That mare's wasted on you." After they departed, Blake turned to Pearl with a mixture of amazement and concern. "That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever witnessed. Harrison owns half the cattle in the county. He was trying to intimidate you," Pearl replied, heart still racing from the confrontation. "Men like that believe they're entitled to whatever they want." Blake studied her with newfound curiosity. "You've stood up to men like him before." It wasn't a question, but Pearl nodded anyway. "It's why I've had to leave so many towns. I objected to a mine owner working children 12 hours a day. I spoke against a mayor who evicted widows when they couldn't pay inflated taxes." Her voice grew quiet. "I refused the advances of a judge who promised to drop charges against my brother if I'd be accommodating." Blake's jaw tightened. "What happened to your brother?" "He died in prison of typhoid fever," Pearl said softly. "I was 18. Blake closed the distance between them, stopping just short of where propriety would object. "I'm sorry, Pearl. The world's been cruel to you." "The world is what it is," she replied. "I just refuse to pretend otherwise." Something shifted between them that afternoon, a deeper understanding that transcended employer and employee. When Blake helped her onto a gentle gelding the following Sunday for a riding lesson, his hands lingering at her waist felt like the most natural thing in the world. By August, Pearl had become essential to the livery's operation. Blake's business flourished with her efficient management, allowing him to take on more horses and even hire a stable boy to help with the increasing workload. They worked side by side, developing an easy rhythm and companionship that made the days pass swiftly. Pearl still kept to herself outside the livery, but she'd begun to hope that Clearwater might become more than another temporary stop. She caught herself imagining a future here, perhaps even opening a small school once she'd saved enough. It was a dangerous hope, but one she couldn't quite extinguish. One evening as Pearl was closing the office, Blake appeared in the doorway with an unusual request. "The harvest dance is Saturday," he said, his typical confidence suddenly wavering. "I wondered if you might accompany me." Pearl's hands stilled on the ledger she'd been closing. "The whole town will be there." "That's generally the idea of a town dance," Blake replied with a gentle smile. "They barely tolerate me now," Pearl said. "If I attend the dance with you, they'll see that I value your company," Blake finished. "Is that so terrible?" Pearl studied his face, the earnest green eyes, the hopeful expression. "You're well liked here, Blake. I wouldn't want to damage that." He stepped closer, close enough that Pearl could see the gold flecks in his eyes. "You know what I've learned about horses? The ones that have been mistreated, they flinch at every raised hand, expecting the worst. Takes time and patience to show them not everyone means harm." The comparison wasn't lost on Pearl. "I'm not a spooked mare." "No," Blake agreed softly. "You're a woman who's learned to expect rejection. I'm asking you to take a chance on something different." Pearl wanted to refuse, to retreat to the safety of isolation, but something in Blake's steady gaze made her nod instead. "Very well. I'll attend the dance with you." Saturday evening found Pearl in her best dress, a modest blue cotton with lace trim that she'd saved for special occasions that never seemed to materialize. Mrs. Patterson helped pin her honey blonde hair into a simple but elegant arrangement, securing it with Pearl's mother's tortoiseshell combs. "You look lovely, dear," the older woman said approvingly. "Mr. McAllister will be quite struck." Pearl blushed. "It's only a dance, Mrs. Patterson." The landlady smiled knowingly. "I've watched that young man call on you every evening this week to walk you home. It may have started as only a dance, but I suspect his intentions go deeper. When Blake arrived to escort her, Pearl nearly didn't recognize him. Gone were the work clothes and dusty boots, replaced by a crisp white shirt, dark waistcoat, and polished boots. His hair was neatly combed, his face cleanly shaven. He looked younger, almost boyish in his nervousness. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering his arm. The town hall had been transformed with lanterns and harvest decorations. As they entered, conversations paused, heads turned, and Pearl felt the weight of 100 curious eyes. She gripped Blake's arm tighter, fighting the urge to flee. "Just breathe," Blake murmured, covering her hand with his. "They're more curious than hostile." True to his word, the outright rejection Pearl expected didn't materialize. Blake's obvious regard served as a buffer against the worst of the judgment. Several of his friends greeted them politely, and Mrs. Patterson's arrival with her sewing circle provided additional social protection. When the music began, Blake led Pearl onto the dance floor. "I should warn you, I'm a better horseman than dancer," he admitted. "Fortunately, I can follow well enough for both of us," Pearl replied, surprised to find herself smiling. They moved together easily, as though their months working side by side had prepared them for this more intimate synchronization. Blake's hand at her waist was respectful but warm, his steps confident despite his disclaimer. Pearl found herself relaxing into the music and the moment. "Thank you for coming tonight," Blake said as they circled the floor. "It matters to me." Pearl looked up into his face, so open and honest it almost hurt to see. "Why did you help me, Blake? That first day when everyone else wanted me gone?" The question had lingered for months. Blake considered it as they completed another turn around the floor. "My father taught me to judge people by their actions, not rumors," he said finally. "And I recognized something in you that day, a strength I admired. You reminded me of my mother." "Your mother?" "She died when I was 16, Blake explained. "She was a suffragist, wrote letters to newspapers advocating for women's rights. The town didn't appreciate her views, but she never stopped believing in equality." Understanding dawned on Pearl. "That's why you weren't put off by my reputation." Blake's hand tightened slightly at her waist. "I saw someone fighting for what's right, not a troublemaker. The world needs more people willing to stand up, not fewer." The music ended, but they remained for a moment in their closed position, something unspoken passing between them. The spell broke when a commotion erupted near the entrance. Harrison had arrived with his ranch hands, all clearly having visited the saloon beforehand. "Well, look here," Harrison called loudly. "McAllister's brought his troublemaking filly to the dance." Blake stiffened beside her. "Ignore him," Pearl whispered. "He's trying to provoke you. The livery business must be failing if he's reduced to hiring women." Harrison continued, his voice carrying across the now silent room. "Or perhaps there are other services being provided?" The insinuation was unmistakable. Several women gasped, and the mayor stepped forward with a half-hearted attempt to calm Harrison. Blake moved forward, his face tight with controlled anger. "Apologize to Miss Evans, Harrison." The larger man laughed. "Or what, boy? You'll challenge me over some schoolteacher who couldn't keep her place." Pearl felt the room closing in, the familiar sensation of a community turning against her. She'd seen it before, the moment when defending her became too costly for her allies. She couldn't bear to watch Blake sacrifice his standing in Clearwater on her behalf. "It's all right, Blake," she said, moving toward the door. "I should go." Blake caught her hand. "No, you belong here as much as anyone." Harrison sneered. "Nobody wants her kind here, McAllister. Ask around. She's been run out of every decent town from here to Ohio." "I want her here," Blake said firmly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And if Clearwater considers itself a decent town, it'll judge people by their character, not gossip." The tension in the room was palpable. Pearl could see the divide forming. Those who respected Blake enough to reconsider, and those aligning with Harrison's cruel dismissal. Before anyone could speak, the doors burst open again. "Fire!" a young boy shouted. "The livery's burning." Blake was running before the words fully registered, Pearl close behind him. Outside, the night sky glowed orange with flames already consuming the rear of the livery. The wooden structure was burning rapidly, and worse, the panicked whinnies of trapped horses cut through the crackling of flames. "The horses," Blake gasped, sprinting toward the inferno. "Help me get them out." Pearl hitched up her skirts and ran alongside him. ignoring the shocked expressions of townspeople spilling from the hall. As they reached the livery, Blake grabbed a bandana, doused it in the water trough, and handed it to Pearl. "Cover your mouth," he instructed, doing the same. "Stay low, open the stalls, and lead them out if you can. If not, just open the gates and run." The heat was overwhelming as they entered through the front, which wasn't yet fully engulfed. Smoke billowed in thick clouds, making it nearly impossible to see. Pearl moved to the nearest stall, coughing even through the damp cloth. The frightened horse inside reared when she opened the gate, nearly trampling her as it bolted for the exit. Pearl moved to the next stall, and the next, freeing horses that fled instinctively toward fresh air. Her lungs burned, her eyes watered, but she pushed forward, counting each animal that escaped. Deeper in the barn, she heard Blake calling to a particularly terrified horse, his voice steady despite the chaos. A support beam cracked overhead. Pearl looked up to see flaming debris falling toward her. Before she could move, strong arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her backward as the beam crashed where she'd stood seconds before. "The roof's going," Blake shouted over the roar of the fire. "We need to get out." "Sophie," Pearl coughed, remembering the dappled mare Blake had refused to sell. "Last stall on the left," Blake said, pointing to the area now almost completely engulfed in flames. "I can't reach her." Pearl could see the separation. Flames now formed a barrier between them and the mare's stall. Blake's face reflected agonizing indecision, the need to save Pearl versus the unbearable thought of abandoning the horse. "Go." Blake pushed her toward the door. "Get out, Pearl." Instead, Pearl wrapped her bandana tighter and darted to the water trough that miraculously hadn't yet emptied. She soaked her skirts thoroughly, then ran toward the flaming barrier. "Pearl, no." Blake's shout followed her as she pressed through the flames, using her wet skirts as minimal protection. The heat seared through to her skin, but she made it past the worst of the fire to Sophie's stall. The terrified mare was pressed against the back wall, eyes rolling in panic. Pearl spoke soothingly, approaching slowly despite the urgency of their situation. "Come on, girl," she whispered, reaching for the mare's halter. "We're going home." The mare resisted at first, then seemed to recognize Pearl. She allowed herself to be led forward as portions of the roof began to collapse around them. Pearl guided the horse toward the exit, but the fire had spread, cutting off their original path. "The back door." Blake's voice called through the smoke and flames. He had circled around, trying to reach them. "By the hay storage." Pearl turned the mare, coughing violently as smoke filled her lungs. Her vision blurred, but she forced herself forward, one hand on Sophie's halter. The back door appeared through the haze, and Blake's silhouette standing in the opening, reaching for them. With the last of her strength, Pearl urged the mare forward and into Blake's waiting hands. As Sophie bolted to safety, Pearl's knees buckled. The world tilted sideways as strong arms caught her, lifting her clear of the collapsing building. The cool night air hit Pearl's smoke-filled lungs like a shock. She gasped and coughed as Blake carried her away from the livery, now fully engulfed in flames. He set her down gently on the grass behind the building, well away from the heat and danger. "What were you thinking?" he demanded, his voice raw with emotion as he examined her for burns. "You could have died in there." Pearl struggled to sit up, still coughing. "I couldn't let you lose her," she managed. "Not after everything." Blake's anger melted into something far more vulnerable. He pulled her against his chest, holding her tightly as if afraid she might disappear. "I don't care about the horse, Pearl. I care about you." The livery collapsed behind them, sending sparks shooting into the night sky. Around them, townspeople formed bucket brigades to prevent the fire from spreading to neighboring buildings. Pearl could see Sophie and the other horses corralled safely in a nearby pasture. "Everything you've built," Pearl whispered, watching Blake's livelihood burn to ashes. "It's all gone." Blake helped her to her feet, his arms supporting her waist. "Not everything," he said quietly. "Not what matters most." The fire burned through the night. By morning, nothing remained of Blake's business but charred timbers and smoke-blackened stone. The town doctor treated Pearl's minor burns and the smoke in her lungs, prescribing rest and clean air, two things in short supply as Blake began the grim task of salvaging what he could. Harrison was conspicuously absent as volunteers helped clear debris. No one spoke the accusation aloud, but the timing of the fire, starting while Blake was at the dance defending Pearl, seemed too convenient to be coincidence. 3 days later, Pearl was reviewing their losses in Mrs. Patterson's parlor, which had become a temporary office. The ledgers had survived in the metal safe, but little else had. Insurance would cover perhaps half the cost of rebuilding, and winter was approaching, the worst possible time to be without shelter for the horses that provided Blake's livelihood. "We could approach the bank for a loan," Pearl suggested as Blake studied the figures with a furrowed brow, "with the insurance money as collateral." "Bank won't lend to me," Blake replied. "Not with Harrison on the board of directors." Pearl set down her pencil. "This is my fault. If I hadn't come to Clearwater, if you hadn't defended me—" "Stop," Blake interrupted firmly. "Harrison's had his eye on my property for years. He wanted to expand his ranch to the creek that runs behind the livery. This isn't about you. But your mother's portrait, your father's tools, all lost because of me." Blake took her hands across the table. "Things, Pearl. Just things. No fire can burn away what they gave me." A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Patterson entered with Sheriff Daniels, whose expression was grimmer than usual. "Found something you should see, Blake," the sheriff said, placing a charred spur on the table. "It's got the Flying H brand stamped on it. Found it in what's left of your hay storage." Blake picked up the twisted metal. "Harrison." The sheriff nodded. "One of his men got liquored up at Molly's place last night. Started bragging about teaching you a lesson. Said Harrison paid $50 to make sure you'd have to sell." "Will you arrest him?" Pearl asked, already knowing the answer. "Hearsay from a drunk ranch hand isn't evidence," the sheriff said apologetically. "And Harrison's got the judge in his pocket anyway. But I thought you should know." After the sheriff left, Blake stared at the burned spur, his expression hardening. "He thinks he's won. That I'll have no choice but to sell him the land now." "What will you do?" Pearl asked quietly. "Rebuild," Blake said without hesitation. "I started with nothing once before, after my parents died. I can do it again." Pearl admired his determination, but the reality of their situation was stark. Winter's coming. The horses need shelter, and temporary stables cost money we don't have. Blake's jaw tightened. "I'll find a way." That evening, Pearl couldn't sleep. She paced her small room at Mrs. Patterson's, weighing impossible choices. Blake's kindness had given her a home when no one else would. Now that same kindness had cost him everything. There had to be a way forward. A knock at her door revealed Mrs. Patterson, still dressed despite the late hour. "You have a visitor downstairs, Miss Evans." "A Mr. James from the Western Union Telegraph Office." Pearl hastily donned her wrapper over her nightgown and hurried downstairs. Mr. James, a thin man with spectacles, held out a telegram. "Came in today, Miss Evans. Thought you'd want to see it right away, given the circumstances." The telegram was brief. "Case against Judge Porter proven, stop disbarred for corruption, stop your testimony, crucial stop settlement, enclosed stop, please confirm receipt." Pearl stared at the paper. Judge Porter, the man who had propositioned her in exchange for her brother's freedom. She'd filed a complaint before fleeing, never expecting justice to prevail. "There's a bank draft as well," Mr. James said, handing her an envelope. "Quite substantial, if I may say so." The settlement was $5,000. More money than Pearl had ever seen. Compensation for her brother's wrongful imprisonment and death, for the judge's abuse of power, for the life she'd been forced to abandon. By morning, Pearl had made her decision. She found Blake at what remained of the livery, already clearing debris with the help of volunteers. "I need to speak with you," she said, drawing him away from the others. Privately, they walked to the creek that ran behind the property, where the water flowed clear and cool over smooth stones. Pearl handed Blake the telegram and bank draft without explanation. He read quickly, his expression shifting from confusion to shock. $5,000? "Pearl, this is enough to rebuild the livery, with improvements," she finished. "I want you to have it." Blake stared at her. "This is your money. Compensation for what happened to your brother. To you. And I'm choosing to invest it," Pearl said firmly. "In the livery. In Clearwater. In us." The word hung between them, charged with meaning. Blake studied her face. "You're staying then? Not just until the livery's rebuilt, but after?" Pearl took a deep breath. "When I arrived here, I believed the frontier had no place for a woman who spoke her mind. That belonging was impossible for someone like me." She gestured to the town behind them. "Then you offered me a chance when no one else would. You showed me that I could be valued, not just tolerated. Blake stepped closer, close enough that Pearl could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. I didn't just value you, Pearl. I fell in love with you. The confession stole her breath. Even knowing what it cost you. It brought me you, Blake said simply. That's worth everything I lost and more. He reached for her hands, holding them between his. I don't want your money, Pearl, but I do want a partnership, in business and in life. Understanding dawned on Pearl. Are you proposing, Blake McAllister? Inelegantly, but yes, he admitted with a smile that transformed his face. I love you, Pearl Evans. I want to build a life with you, not because you can help me rebuild the livery, but because you already helped rebuild me. Pearl felt tears welling in her eyes. I've never belonged anywhere. Not truly. Blake lifted one hand to her cheek. You belong with me, he said softly. If you'll have me. Her answer was a whispered yes against his lips as she rose on tiptoes to kiss him. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as the morning sun warmed their shoulders and the creek bubbled its approval nearby. They rebuilt the livery together that autumn, a larger structure with proper stables and a comfortable adjoining house with a view of the creek. Pearl's investment became their shared dream, expanded with modern amenities and enough space for the future they both envisioned. Harrison fumed when Blake refused to sell, even as construction began. His threats fell on deaf ears, especially after the Western Union officer testified to his drunken ranch hand's confession, resulting in a substantial fine for arson. Their December wedding was attended by the entire town, including those who had once whispered against Pearl. Her courage during the fire had transformed public opinion, but it was her quiet dignity afterward that truly won their respect. Mrs. Patterson cried openly as Pearl walked down the aisle in a cream-colored gown with pearl buttons, a wedding gift from the dressmaker who had once turned her away. By spring, the new McAllister livery and breeding stables had become Clearwater's pride. Pearl established a small evening school in one corner of the office, teaching ranch hands and their children to read and write. No one objected to her progressive methods. Not when Blake McAllister stood proudly beside his wife at town meetings, his hand warm against her back. Sophie, the dappled gray mare saved from the fire, delivered a healthy foal the following May, the first of many born in the new stables. Blake named the colt Phoenix, smiling at Pearl across the straw-covered stall. From the ashes, he explained, his arms slipping around her still slender waist. The best things often rise from what seems like ending. Pearl leaned into his embrace, thinking of all the rejections that had led her to this moment, to this man who had seen her strength when others saw only trouble, who had chosen her when others had turned away. I spent so long believing I had to choose between speaking my truth and finding acceptance, she said, watching the newborn foal nuzzle its mother. I never imagined I'd find someone who loved me because of my convictions, not despite them. Blake pressed a kiss to her temple. You were looking for a town that would accept you, but what you needed was a heart that would embrace all of you. As twilight settled over their home, Pearl stood with Blake on the porch of the house they'd built together. Lights from Clearwater twinkled in the distance, no longer a place of rejection, but a community where they'd earned respect. The livery stable housed 30 horses, with a reputation spreading across the territory for Blake's expert breeding program and Pearl's efficient management. I received a letter today, Pearl said, leaning against the porch railing, from a young woman in Minnesota who read about our school in the territorial paper. She asked if we might need another teacher. Blake smiled, recognizing what Pearl was suggesting. Someone else looking for a fresh start? Pearl nodded. She sounds like she speaks her mind. Apparently, that's unwelcome where she's from. Tell her there's a place for her here, Blake replied, drawing Pearl into his arms as the first stars appeared overhead. Tell her Clearwater's learned that the strongest communities are built by those brave enough to stand for what's right. Pearl rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady heartbeat that had become her anchor. Every rejection had led her here. Every closed door had directed her path to the one man who would say the words she'd longed to hear her entire life. You belong with me. And in his arms, beneath the vast Dakota sky, Pearl Evans McAllister finally knew the truth of those words in the deepest part of her soul.